So, hello, Carol, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming to chat with me today about your experiences and the incredible work that you do in the world. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
I would love to, and thank you for having me. I'm Carol Murchison. I'm a lawyer. I was a retired lawyer, but then I got involved in, uh, I would say, investigating sexual misconduct in spiritual communities, kind of by chance. But in my prior legal life, I was an employment lawyer, and I did, um, among other things, investigations in the workplace. Into sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, all of those kinds of things. And I counseled um, corporations and companies on how to make the workplace better. So I'd had a little bit of experience in that. And maybe that's the background to what I'm doing right now.
Of lawyers and litigators and attorneys, there's so much lingo that is thrown around that I don't really understand that well. So I wondered if you could just explain to myself and the listeners if there's differences between those terms, and if you want to do the type of law work that you were doing, do you
Mhm.
have to have specific training in certain areas, or can all lawyers take part in all manner of law?
Well, I guess, and it's such an interesting question because the British system is very different, right, from the American system. So I can really only talk to the American system, and I think more generally to the kind of experience and that kind of thing that lawyers have. So what the litigation, just to give us a little bit of of a definition here, is what we call a process. It's the process of going to court and making a complaint and saying something bad happened to me, and this other person who's the defendant is owes me something. They owe me some kind of duty, some kind of repair. And um and that litigation process has litigators. Those are the lawyers who are, we kind of duke it out in place of our clients having to do that. And a litigator could be on the plaintiff side. So the plaintiff is the person who's bringing the case, who feels that they've been harmed, or a litigator could be on the defendant's side. That is the person who's saying, no, that isn't true, or no, I'm not responsible. And so for me, what I am is that I am a litigator on the plaintiff side. So I only represent um, people who have been harmed and who want to bring a claim. Does that make sense?
It does. And I do think that if I was ever a lawyer in a past life or in a next life, I would hope to also be on the side of helping people get justice if they
Yes.
have been harmed, as opposed to the other type of lawyer.
Well, we have lawyers should have at least a strong belief in that everyone is entitled to a defense. And so I think that for me, I have actually been on both sides. So I've been on the defense side of defending corporations. I think it's all in how you do it in a certain way. But I will say that being on the side of individuals who have been harmed is a very satisfying in lots of ways, because it's giving people voice who don't have, another alternative. So it appeals to all of those kind of underdog,
Oh, yes.
justice seeking genes.
Especially if it's individuals going up against big old destructive
Oh,
groups, which I'm sure we'll
yes.
get into as we go through our conversation. The other thing that sometimes I think gets miscommunicated in sometimes news articles and various media pieces on court cases is the difference between civil cases and federal cases. can all lawyers work on both cases, or is it specific types again that can only work on federal cases?
Well, so let me first say that so that your listeners know that I'm really only talking about the US law, because it's I think it's even a little bit different in Canada and certainly different in the UK. But the two different, and I think this would be the same in the UK, two different kind of pathways, let's call them, of the law are criminal and civil. Okay, so um, the criminal justice system, the end result is jail. If you are convicted, well, you might get a suspended sentence, but you get found guilty of something that is a crime. And it is those litigators that we were talking about before, those people are called like crown prosecutors or district attorneys, and they work for the government. So that's the, the kind of outline of the criminal justice system. The civil justice system, the person who's been harmed that we're talking about, the plaintiff, has their own lawyer. So that's a person like me. And they go to a different branch of the court, and there is a defendant, and that person generally has a lawyer. And the end result of that is not jail, but it's usually some kind of recompense, some kind of reparations, generally money. And so those are the two kinds. Now, within both kinds, there are federal laws and there are state laws, just to make it more complicated, right?
I love this. This is great. I am placing when you read about certain district attorneys having like almost a level of like infamy in the legal system, and you're wondering why is somebody so notable, but now I realize it's all kind of fitting into place. This is great.
It's helpful for people to understand the difference between the two systems, because I think what I have found, and I wonder whether you have found the same thing with the folks that you interview and your listeners, that we only think of the criminal justice system. So when I tell people, when people say to me, I went to the police, I went to the district attorney, they wouldn't take my case, then people give up because they think that that's the only thing that's available to them. But there's a whole other part of the justice system that's based on the civil law. And by the way, it has much less of I think the pathway to a legal resolution is not an easy one, but the criminal one is particularly difficult, I think, because you don't have your own attorney, because the burden of proof is very high. When we go to put someone in jail, we want to know that they are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not the same standard in the civil justice system. And so it's often easier. They have they have their own lawyer to protect them and defend them.
Gosh, it's tricky already, isn't it? Because if you're working with individuals who have been, and I imagine in some cases severely abused and coerced, and there is an option for a criminal case because of things we talked about before we hit record, like statute of limitations.
Mhm.
If there's the opportunity for a civil case with perhaps a financial payout at the end, does that always feel like justice? Because I'm not sure that it does. So I guess there's that tricky thing.
It is. It is very tricky. And what I have started to feel like is, because I didn't always work with survivors. I worked with corporations, which is a completely different animal, obviously, but not all of the nuances were clear to me when I started doing this work. What I understand now is that I try to listen to what the survivor wants for themselves. So some survivors will say, I want to put this person in prison. And in which case, then obviously the only route is the criminal justice system. Um, Other survivors want don't want to go the criminal route because it is portrayed, and it is to a certain extent very hard on the person bringing the case. I mean, you have only to look at, shows on television or in the movies to see a survivor who's sitting in a in a courtroom in a witness chair being torn apart by another the defendant's attorney. So it's not always a pretty sight. But for many people, the criminal justice system, for a variety of reasons, is not something that they want to pursue. And the idea of some kind of reparations for the harm that has been done to them is, it's a good thing. So, sometimes people say to me, I don't want the money. I don't want to be known as a person who did this for the money. And I have two feelings about that. One is, if you've been harmed, you deserve to be able to heal from it, and the healing takes money.
Yep.
And the second thing is that money is the currency of justice in the civil justice system. Anne Oliverius, who's the founder of the law firm that I work with in London, said that to me a couple of years ago, and I thought, that is really true, isn't it? That is a currency of justice. It is about all that we have to offer is jail or money. And neither of them are necessarily going to heal people. And so I listen to what survivors want to see what it is that will help them reach the objective of healing.
This is all incredible. I'm learning so much already, and I thrive off of like adding to my own education into how these things work. So thank you so much, Carol. This is great. I'm also thinking that if a civil route is the one that's pursued and there is a monetary payout at the end, which of course can help pay for expensive therapy, if there aren't any stipulations around how the case is won or settled in terms of non-disclosure agreements or sealed records, there's also the chance that the information and all of the things that have happened in that legal suit are then available to the public as well. So even if you go down the civil route and you're thinking, oh, what will I do with this money? There's still a chance that somebody can research, the name of the person that's had the case brought against them or has been accused of horrific things, and then see, wow, this person's been successfully sued.
Yes. Yes, so you've raised a couple of very interesting points there. So the first one is what is called an NDA, or a non-disclosure agreement. So in past years, non-disclosure agreements were almost universally done. So what that means is that if you sue a person, let's say, because we're talking about cult leaders, we sue a cult leader because that person sexually assaulted someone and there is a monetary payout. It used to be that there would almost always be a non-disclosure agreement, which would prevent the parties to it, that is the plaintiff and the defendant, from talking about it. Now, maybe since Harvey Weinstein, maybe since 2017 and the Me Too movement, we've seen a number of cases in which people do not want to sign a non-disclosure. And it's interesting that you followed up our prior conversation about what the survivor wants with this, because sometimes the survivor says, I want to talk about it. I want to tell people what happened to me. And, my own personal feeling is that the non-disclosure agreement should be not permitted as against public policy. Because if we have a group of people who are assaulting other people under the guise of religion, then we all need to know about that to protect ourselves, our sisters, our brothers, our children, our neighbors. But that's not the case yet. However, a non-disclosure is not required. It makes it harder sometimes to settle cases because obviously the people who are giving out the money don't want people to know about what they've done. But I will also tell your listeners that in a lot of cases, court records are public records. You can go, unless they've been sealed by the judge, which is usually done only if it's a minor, you can go and look up the case. Also, a non-disclosure agreement does not prevent other people from talking about it. And so it doesn't prevent your mother, your sister, your brother, your father, well, whoever who knows about what happened to you from speaking.
Gosh,
There are
that's a
other
big
things.
old loophole, isn't it?
Yes, it
Like,
is.
I've signed a non-disclosure form, but I'm going to sit down with you. I'm going to tell you my whole story, and then you can tell it to other people.
Well, I think that the way that it would be legitimately is that you told other people before you were bound by the non-disclosure
Right.
agreement. Right. So you don't want to sign the non-disclosure and then go around telling people, because that would be violating the non-disclosure. Now, there's an open question about what could be done about that, but um, presumably there is, I mean, there is a legal option for the defendant, but I'm talking about in the course of the litigation, in the course of what has happened to you, you've told a lot of other people, they are not necessarily bound by that agreement. So the non-disclosure agreement, well, so you said an interesting thing in there, which a lot of survivors say to me, which is, as I said, the kind of, all I'm going to get is money and I don't want the money. And what I tell people is, you can do anything you want to with the money. I mean, you could give the money back to them the next day if you wanted to. It's your money. And generally speaking, when people get to that point, they do find that the money doesn't the money never compensates for what's happened to people, but it makes, as you said, expensive therapy and other healing things possible. It makes life somewhat easier. And so I encourage people by saying, you can decide what it is that you want to do with that money. And if you still feel like you didn't want the money and you want to give it back to them the next day, um, I'm guessing not a lot of people feel that way by the time that they've been through the process, but it's a possibility. It's yours. And I think that's something that's very satisfying for survivors about coming to the end of a legal process like the civil justice system, is that it belongs to you. You have taken back your voice. You have taken back the power that was taken away from you. And that is more important, I think, in the end, than the money. The money's like a byproduct of that.
I think of Dan Shaw during this conversation and
Oh,
his
I
work
love
around
Dan Shaw.
traumatic.
I love
Sorry,
Dan Shaw.
I imagine thinking about his work around traumatic narcissism and how it must feel for individuals who are told that they have to give
Yes.
something to the people that they have abused. Oh gosh, it must make them want to tear their insides out, I imagine.
I imagine that it does. And I have to say that I feel okay about that.
Yep.
You know, I mean, it's a very interesting point, isn't it? That it isn't one-sided. So the giving of the money, the being through the civil justice system, is a way of bringing to the perpetrator the consequences of their actions in a very real way. I know you have young children, and so that, as parents, we're always trying to find the way to communicate with our children that you can do certain things, but then you have to deal with the consequences of your actions. And cult leaders do not ever have to deal with the consequences of their actions unless we can go through a system like the civil justice system or the criminal justice system.
With a civil case, would individuals still be given the opportunity to read out victim impact statements?
Yes, absolutely. Sure.
I
Absolutely.
think that must be a big thing for an individual who has experienced trauma and abuse to stand up in a place where they have to be listened to. The
Yes.
defendant has no choice but to listen to what their victims have to say about what's happened to them.
And the thing is also, and this is a frightening thing for survivors, quite frankly, but also you get to tell your story under oath, sitting in the same room. That's a frightening part. But litigation doesn't happen overnight. In fact, it happens over way too many nights, because it's a long, drawn out process. But in many ways, I feel that that is an advantage for survivors, because they're healing also day by day. And I tell my clients, your future self is going to be able to deal with this. It's going to be able to deal with being in the same room and telling your story and having it be heard.
Oh, it's really powerful stuff. It's amazing. You mentioned that your earlier work included working with corporations around the subject of sexual misconduct. So, in terms of that phrase, can you give us what the term means and also how the term has changed over time? Because at this point in your career, I imagine you've seen different laws, different things be brought in around, maybe you remember a time where there wasn't even anything in place around sexual misconduct in workplaces.
Oh, I do. I absolutely do. I will tell you that, um, in the United States, again, in 1964, Congress passed what they call the Civil Rights Act, which protected people from discrimination on the basis of many protected characteristics. Well, it ended up being many, but race and gender, eventually age, religion was one of the original ones, disability has been added. And then it began to be expanded to include not just discriminating against people, like not giving them a job because of their race or their gender, but harassing them in the workplace. And so that evolved from 1964 until, I think, in the United States in 1986, the Supreme Court decided the first case in which they said it's not okay for a manager to have sex with an employee because they need the job and you can never tell whether it was consensual. That was in 86. And so, then in the early 1990s, we began to see a kind of an explosion of cases that had to do with harassment because of a televised hearings of Anita Hill versus Clarence Thomas, which Americans may know, but it was about this the confirmation hearings of a Supreme Court justice who was accused by a woman of sexually harassing her in the workplace. And at that point, I think it was in the early 90s, let's say, all of that exploded. And so, yes, I have seen a tremendous, arc of movement in this area, from being it's okay to do this to women or men, but the majority of the sexual harassment cases are women, but the law is gender neutral. And so it could be either. And to see that, move on along then from the late 90s, when many corporations, and your listeners who work for companies will recognize this, where we began to have a policy in place that says this is what you cannot do. And if this happens to you, then this is how you deal with it. It's the kind of HR policy on sexual harassment and discrimination. And we've seen that evolve over time from being something like, a lot of the early cases, very crude things, women who went to work in all male industries and were harassed, they were called names, they were touched inappropriately, all of those things. Until now, we're aware of even more subtle kinds of harassment that we don't permit in the workplace. And I think the kind of second phase of that has come about since 2017 with Harvey Weinstein, and the kind of a public awareness of the fact. I tell people, and this always comes as a kind of a shock, when I speak with oftentimes Buddhist organizations, I tell them that corporate America is doing a better job on this than Buddhist America. And that is a shocking statement, right? But they are. They're not, it's not because they're better people. It's because they're clear about what the law is and what their responsibilities are. And so many of these religious organizations that are crossing the line don't know that.
You've seen so much change and shift around harassment in the workplace, sexual misconduct in the workplace, and you mentioned that typically those cases is sexual harassment against women. And I was thinking about a conversation that I had the other day with Evan Stark, and he was talking about how women will always be at risk of domestic violence, of sexual harassment until there are equal rights for everyone. Otherwise, there's a power imbalance. And as soon as you have a power imbalance, you're talking then about the manager and the employee
Yes.
scenario. It could be a husband and wife in the house. If there is a power imbalance in terms of the man goes out to make the money because there are not equal opportunities for the woman to go out and do that, then already there's a power imbalance on so many different levels. And it's again, until we have equal rights for people, we are not going to see the end of coercive control of women, whether it's at home,
Mm-hmm.
in the workplace, in religious groups, in cults. And I wonder how it feels for you, being a woman, to see this shift in the women's rights movement that has been happening since sort of the 70s.
I think it's phenomenal. I remember some years ago I also did sexual harassment training in a lot of different environments, and I was doing a training in a hospital for doctors. And a lot of the doctors my own age were they were quite offended at this what they considered to be the sensitivity, the overly sensitive younger female doctors, and to some extent male doctors who supported them. And I see that as just such a tremendous advance for us, that younger women and younger men are not willing to put up with a lot of the well, I was going to use a swear word, but you could fill in the blank there, that those of us who have been through all of these wars have had to put up with. It's tremendously encouraging to me that 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 younger women and men are saying, we're here to work. And I would say the same thing about cults. The thing is that religion should be a positive thing in people's lives. And when you were talking about the abuse of power and the power imbalance, I was thinking about the fact that, to me, that is the one major marker that's like number one on my list of things that mark a cult. Because lots of times people will say, and I'm sure you get this question too, Casey, what is a cult? Is and sometimes people will say, well, to me, well, Christianity is a cult. Well, I suppose it depends, but rather than try to decide what the definition of a cult is, I look at what I see as the markers of what makes a cult-like organization, right? And the number one thing is power, abuse of power, a leader who cannot be questioned, a leader who is never wrong, a leader who knows what is good for you more than you know what is good for yourself. And there are many more, but that power imbalance, I think, is at the heart of what makes a cult a cult.
I completely agree, 100%. And I wrote down a quote that you said earlier, that in 1986, things really changed in terms of recognizing harassment in the workplace. Then you said they need a job and you can never tell if it's consensual. And that's where the power imbalance is between managers and employees, for example. But you could just change the word job. They need a community. They need a
Yes,
family. They need,
yes,
you could put anything in that sentence and it would have the same outcome. They need an X, and you can never tell if it's consensual. So as soon as there is that power imbalance, wherever it happens, there's
yes.
the opportunity for exploitation. And yeah, so I mean, it's so interesting that you found this specific niche to work in, and we were talking about it before we hit the record button, because you asked me how I started the podcast, and I said I don't know how I got here, but here I am, and you said I'm same boat.
Yes, I'm in exactly the same boat. And I think that it's so important that people understand these markers so that they can identify them. You know, what I see, and I'm sure you do too, is that people come out of some of these organizations, spiritual communities, they've been harmed, they've been wounded, and that if we did a better job of raising awareness, which is why your work is so important, that people, that at some point somebody would say, wait a minute, somebody is telling me that they have the truth, the way, the enlightenment, they're holding that, and that they know better than me what is good for me. And the way this manifests in my world is that somebody, and this happens all the time, will say, you need to have sex with me because this will put you further along the path to your spiritual on your spiritual path, or to enlightenment, or just because I feel that this is what you need to overcome the dark places in your soul. These are all things in which someone else is substituting their judgment for that person's. And I wish that we had so much awareness that when that happens, some voice in people's head would say, wait a minute, maybe this isn't right. But in cults, as you know, people are isolated often from their families, from other people. They're not going out to coffee with a friend that they had from high school. And when they tell them this, that friend says to them, hey, that sounds crazy to me. They don't get that input from the outside that we all get on a daily basis when we talk to our friends and our family, and they say to us, well, gee, that sounds like a crazy idea, mom. I don't know why you'd want to do that. They don't get that, because they're isolated. They have been sucked in hook, line, and sinker.
I think about Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh when you mentioned I need you to have sex with me, or I think you should have sex with me to, to reach enlightenment. And I think about Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, also known as Osho. I just rolled my eyes. I mean, no one can see me
Yes,
rolling my eyes, but anyone that listens to the show will know exactly how I feel about
it was an
Osho.
eye roll
In
there.
yeah, Osho in pop culture is one of I will die on that hill.
Yeah.
But it only came to light recently. Everyone thought that this person, who was supposedly an enlightened being, was celibate. But it's only come to light recently that the inner circle of women that he kept around himself, he coerced into having sex with him under the guise of, I can only keep my enlightenment if I channel your energy through sex. So it doesn't it's the same tactic, and it's basically the same saying the same thing, just using,
It
slightly
is.
different words.
Yeah, that's right. It's saying your duty is to help me, which is,
Yep,
just a flip of the my duty is to help you. It's
yep.
the same thing. And it's so interesting. You've used the word coercion a number of times, and I don't want to forget to talk about how coercion um, plays out in at least US law in terms of the human trafficking laws, which is what we've been, experimenting with, I would say, and not the only ones, certainly, but in using human trafficking as a way of bringing some accountability to these folks.
I'm thinking of several cases off the top of my head where people have been found guilty of human trafficking. So yeah,
Yes.
absolutely can see that's going to be another very interesting conversation. Um, there's so many people I think of. I did an episode last month, uh, an exclusive episode where I talked about Lou Castro and Angel's Landing, and I was just doing my research, learning how Daniel Perez, also known as Lou Castro, managed to convince people that he had three angels possessing him that gave him supernatural abilities. And in
Mm.
order for him to maintain his health, he needed to have sex with the children. So there was lengthy grooming that took place, and young girls, children, I mean, shouldn't even say underage girls, children grew up thinking that it was again their duty to permit this man to
Yes.
keep his supernatural abilities. And again, it's him saying, just as Bhagwan did, if you don't help me, I can't help you. If I'm not enlightened, you can't become enlightened. If I don't have these supernatural abilities, then I can't predict your death or prevent your death, or any other manner of wild claims that this man made, who is now in prison and will not be eligible for parole until he is 120 years old. You'll all be very happy to know.
I'm saying hallelujah.
So now that we have an understanding of how different parts of the law work, what sexual misconduct looks like and how it's evolved and changed, it's time to partner the two things together in terms of religion and faith-based groups. So when people say faith-based to me, we've mentioned America, Canada, the UK. I think predominantly in terms of the Western world, I think of Christianity. Have you worked on many cases linked to this major religion, or would you say that actually there's a lot of other groups involved that aren't necessarily Christian-based groups?
I would say both. So we have a case right now of a Christian-based group, and it's a child sexual assault case. Because New York has opened up its statutes of limitations, we're seeing a lot of cases of children who were abused, but who did not have a legal pathway to accountability because the statute of limitations, which is, for your listeners, the period of time in which you can actually bring a case. And so this is a constant challenge, but New York opened up their statute. And so, yes, we have a Christian case. However, when I think of faith-based communities or even spiritual communities, in addition to what I think of as the, kind of major religions that we might see in the West, I have certainly seen cases, several Buddhist cases, Buddhist communities, which always surprises people because they have a vision, a perhaps romanticized vision of Buddhism as being a peaceful, um, violent, non-threatening religion, which the teachings, of course, are. Because when I always feel like I need to say to folks that when we're talking about this, we're not necessarily talking about the teachings of any of these groups, which bring solace and strength and a lot of very positive things to people. We're talking about when the teachings are manipulated by a leader who has total control, sometimes a charismatic leader who is doing all those things that we're talking about. So I uh, I see much more cult-like activity in other in two areas. Uh, well, three, I will say. One is Buddhism, which has come to the West and brought, as I said, many good things, but also, as many religions, completely um, uh, what do I want to say? I don't want to say unsupervised, but it's like that. There is no controlling organization. And so people are free to do what they want. And when, as you said before you hit record, you and I were talking about how we fell into this work. And the way I fell into this work was that I read an article about a woman who was doing something that she called Buddhist Project Sunshine. And she was trying to provide a space for women to come forward, and men, by the way, in that situation, who had been abused within a particular Buddhist community in Canada and in Boulder, Colorado. And I don't know why I reached out to her. I wonder many days why I did, but I did. And I said to her, because the only thing I knew was how to investigate, right? I said, gee, they need to do with these or this kind of claim, they need to do an investigation. And she said, well, they're not speaking to me, so they're not going to do an investigation. And in a kind of just split second, well, I'm retired, I'm a lawyer, I've done investigations, that kind of impulse, I'll just look at what she has. And within weeks, something that neither she nor I knew at the time is that a number of women had been sexually assaulted by the leader of the organization, not just people within the organization. That was in 2018, I think, and it got a lot of press. Then the next thing I knew, someone came forward and said, what would you do? I didn't know. I didn't even know that this was a thing. Would you look at what has happened to this group of women? And I did that. Then I did a yoga investigation. I've done a number of Buddhist investigations of all kinds. And eventually what I saw is that what I was doing was giving voice to the women's stories, because as you know, cult organizations are not big on providing a forum for people to have a disagreeing opinion or another point of view. And so they had been silenced, they had been ostracized, many of them had been thrown out of the organization or had to leave it. And I saw myself as giving voice and bringing that voice with some collaboration to the organization itself, to the cult organization, to say, you need to do better. You need to provide accountability. And I can tell you that in almost every case, I failed because they weren't interested in accountability, which is what led me to start saying that corporate America is doing better than Buddhist America, because a lot of the organizations who are engaged in this kind of sexual misconduct do not care. And then I met Ann Oliverius, and she had a law firm, and she was a fierce fighter for women's rights. And I started funneling these investigations to her because legal action was the only thing that was left. And then I joined her firm. And so there you are. That's what I had a 4-year pro bono project, because I never charged any money, just because I could, because I could do it. And because, like you, probably it appealed to the kind of sense of justice and sense of trying to bring some kind of healing to people who were harmed.
what a journey that is to get to where you are now, all as somebody who was like, I thought I was retiring, and yet here I am.
Yes, but I feel, I feel on a daily basis. At the same time, anyone who's a lawyer, anyone who's ever been involved in litigation will tell you that there are many hard moments, and there are hard moments for lawyers as well, because particularly when we are invested in the health and well-being and the mental well-being of our clients, it is difficult. But I have to say that every day I feel absolutely grateful that I can do this work.
You mentioned earlier that religions should be a positive thing.
Yes.
And you also included that in the Equality Act, religion was added into the various different communities and groups that should be treated equally in terms of employment opportunities, at least. And I know things have changed as well, but religions, they should be positive because get to they get the benefits of being recognized faith-based groups and communities, including things like tax breaks and exemptions, including things like being a part of the Equality Act, not being drafted into war. There's lots of things that come with that title. Um, and this is where I struggle, because I recognize through my work recently that not all faith-based groups are destructive. Some are very positive communities. Some are only positive communities because they recognize that religious trauma happens, because they recognize that there is not a lot of recognition or space for the LGBTQIA plus community in a lot of religious and faith-based spaces. So how come there is no protection inside religious groups when they are when they're basically protected by government law, by things that are written in law? It just, I really can't articulate what I'm trying to say, and I think you might be able to a lot better, but it's frustrating.
Yes, it is. I know I'm shaking my head here, Casey, which your listeners can't see, but I'm shaking my head because I have all of the, kind of similar feelings. Like these are organizations that are protected in the United States. They're not only protected, you can't be discriminated or harassed on the basis of your religion. And I think that's a good idea. They are protected by the First Amendment. So you are free to practice your religion, which is where we get very close to what we're talking about with cults, right? Because they are practicing something that is harmful. And as you said, it is very irksome to me that they get tax breaks and all other kind of financial benefits, and in many cases do not give back to the communities that they're living in. That's not the case in all religious groups, of course, but a fair number, I would say, do not. And so, yes, all of that is quite aggravating to me. Here is how we deal with it from a legal perspective. We very much have to separate out the religious belief from the actions. So this is the reason that I've been talking about what I'm doing very specifically as sexual assault, sexual misconduct in faith-based or spiritual communities, with a focus on the sexual assault part, because sexual assault is illegal. And so when we're litigating these things, we are not talking about belief, we are talking about action. And so you don't get a free pass to murder people, just to give an extreme example, because you dream up that your religion allows you to do that. If you were to say, let's say you were walking down the street and you said, I believe that Satan is abiding in that person, so I'm going to take out my gun and I'm going to shoot them. Well, it's not the belief that we're attacking, it's the action. And so where we have laws that protect the action, that's what we go for. And this is at the heart of what I feel is the difficulty for cult survivors, is that sexual assault is not the only harm that is done. There's financial harm, there's psychological harm, there are so many different harms, but there's no legal pathway for those, or let's just say they're extremely limited if they exist. And so what only thing we can do is to go over the action that deal with the action that is illegal. So that's where we have to start. Is the action illegal? Because that gives, then what we're not attacking religion or beliefs, we're attacking action. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm thinking of so many different things as you talk about not attacking the belief, but looking at what is illegal and taking action on what is, I don't know, provable or in
Yes,
a, because financial coercion or extortion, in some cases, you might be able to look at that and say, wow, this con artist managed to get this much money from me. There are cases where I'm sure you could do that, but it's tricky. So
it
I'm
is.
kind of working through as you explain it,
Mhm.
but then I'm thinking it gets even more difficult even then, and I imagine you've come up against this, where individuals who were born and raised in religious groups and faith-based groups don't realize that sexual assault and rape is illegal. It's normalized to them, it's expected from them, and that in turn does become their belief system. So,
Yes, it
how
does.
do you untangle those things as well, Carol? That must be
Yes.
so tough.
Well, I think what is difficult is that awareness piece that we talked about before, when people are isolated and where they are second generation and they have not had any exposure to anything outside of that a particular cult-like organization with which to challenge that belief. And so the difficulty is this, that those people do not come forward because they don't ever know. So that those people who do come forward, because there's been some kind of an aha moment for them, those people are, they're just heroic in my mind, because they are leading a charge for thousands of other people who don't know. And if we keep it under a rock, if we keep it swept under the rug, then they will never know. But sometimes that knowledge gets in. It does. Somehow or another, a seed gets planted. I will give you an example without using any names, an organization in which absolutely the leader was a pedophile. And as you suggested with the with your other example, was grooming and sexually assaulting children. There was an article in a magazine about this in the 90s. And the people who were in the cult were told these people are evil, they're the devil trying to get us and destroy us. And many of them, at least the ones that I now know, believed that. But eventually other things happened. And that little piece of knowledge of that article stayed in the unconscious, and it came out later and became part of a whole, almost like a jigsaw puzzle of pieces that they were able to put together. So I feel that every piece of public information has the opportunity to plant a seed that gets heard, seen, talked about somehow, exactly so that those folks that you're talking about begin to question what has been taught to them.
There's been a lot of cases recently that you may have even been involved in, which is a really interesting thing to consider, around organizations like the Jehovah's Witnesses, where historical cases of covered up and hidden child sexual abuse are that the cases are now coming to the forefront in different states, in different countries. So if we speak specifically about the US, and I think it's Pennsylvania most recently, there were some elders that were charged for sexually assaulting children in various kingdom halls. Are you up to date with these types of cases? Are you involved in any of these cases? And again, is the statute of limitations different state to state? So there might be cases where even if it becomes public record that there's been covered up cases of sexual abuse, that nothing might be able to come of it.
First of all, I can't comment, on any cases that I'm involved in, but I know exactly what you're talking about. And so let me say, what I can tell you is about the statute of limitations, because this is the very first, I think of like getting to the starting line of a legal case as having to run and jump over those hurdles, like the track people do, they're running and they jump over a big hurdle. That's the first hurdle, is the statute of limitations. And it is different state to state in the United States. Now, let me just say, in case you have any Canadian listeners tuned in, that Canada has no statute of limitations. This is an enlightened society up there in the north of the United States, a country who recognizes that trauma takes time to process. 10 years, 20 years, 40 years would not be uncommon. We know this. People like Dan Shaw, who are, therapists and psychologists who are dealing with this, tell us that. We know it. And Canada has responded to that by eliminating their statute of limitations in sexual assault cases. So that is a truly enlightened government and society. In the United States, it goes state by state. So, and it's incredibly complicated. Before I started working for Anne, I could not have even imagined how incredibly complicated that it is, because I had never encountered this. But so let me say that first, each state has its own statute of limitations for the state law claims, like sexual assault is a state law claim. And those statute of limitations can be extremely short or longer. It depends on whether you were a child when you were assaulted, because we have reached a level of enlightened thinking where we know that children have a very hard time coming forward. They don't have language for what happened to them. They are like your second generation example. They don't know that what happened to them was wrong until much later and so we typically see longer statutes of limitations on sexual assault against children. However, what I would say is the very same thing that we would say about a child also happens to adults. And particularly, it happens to adults who are in cult-like organizations, because they don't have language for it. You gave the perfect example earlier of the second gen person who's been raised with this to feel that this is normalized. And so whether you're a child or an adult, the statutes of limitations need to be longer. Now, Some states have gone to longer statutes, but not long enough, in my view. In addition, some states, and New York is one, California is one, Colorado is one, they are opening up Colorado abolished statutes of limitations, but it doesn't go back. It's not retroactive, it's going forward. California has had a series of what I would call an open window. So they've opened the door and said, during this year, and this is happening in New York right now, for example, in this year, beginning November 2023 until November 2024, if you were sexually assaulted in New York as an adult, we don't care when it was. That window will close in November. And then those assaults will no longer have a legal path to justice. Does that make sense? So it's completely unorganized, disorganized,
No coherence.
and on a state by state basis. Federal law, and the human trafficking law in the United States is a federal law. The human trafficking law is 10 years, but President Biden just in October said that going forward, there will be no statute of limitations for children who come under the human trafficking law. I think the activism there is that it also needs to be expanded to adults who come under the human trafficking law for exactly the same reasons.
In one of these cases with the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, if an individual is sexually abused in one state, they can't go to another state where there is differing statute of limitations and say, well, if I can't sue you in this state, I'll sue you in this state instead.
Well, so now I'm going to introduce you to a favorite phrase that lawyers use. It depends. So, in fact, we used to joke that, lawyers spend 3 years in law school learning all different ways to say how to say it depends. So here's why it depends. Generally speaking, you're right but what if the organization was headquartered in another state? So each state, if you think about it in the United States, is saying, why should I use my resources in the court system to adjudicate this case? And so there has to be a reason. One of the big reasons is, of course, because the action took place in my state. But there are other reasons. It could be that being headquartered in the state is one, so maybe the group has its headquarters in one state and you go to another state. So it's the kind of thing that's not easily analyzed, as just a simple yes or no, hence the it depends. But basically, I know in our Canada cases that we have several plaintiffs involved who were not assaulted in Canada. But we believe that we have good legal reasons based on the law in Canada where Canada should say, yes, I should use my judicial resources to adjudicate this case on behalf of this person. One of them is that the leader of the group went to another state, assaulted the person, and was there, so to speak, on business, and then went back to Canada. And so that's a reason why Canada might take what's called take jurisdiction over the case.
Okay.
So there's a lot of, and of course, this is where lawyers try to get creative and look for all of the reasons why, in this case, the court should take that case. So I wouldn't say no, it could never be. I would say it's a kind of a caution that there's another little jump that has to, be gone over.
Would you say then that in this circumstance, this is where politics comes into play? Because if people are hoping to get elected, re-elected, If attorney generals want to make names for themselves, they'll say, if you want to try that case over here, which I think will get a lot of publicity, which I think if we win will make me look great, we will use our money to put this case through our state system.
Well, so it should not go that way. I would never say that something either does or doesn't go that way, but it shouldn't go that way. So, because first of all, those district attorneys and the attorney general of the different states are working on the criminal justice system. I mean, that they might, and I absolutely think that on the criminal side, a district attorney may say, this is a case that we need to take because as an issue of public policy, we want to resolve this. So yes, I think that happens. On the civil side, the judges should be looking at the law. And now, of course, every one of us is influenced by our own experiences and our own views of life, and so they're no different. But that's where their decision making should come from.
Right. The reason I asked that question is because I was thinking in regards to Utah, which I understand is a whole state unto itself at this point over in America in terms of law and lawsuits and religious groups and breaking the law and sexual abuse cases and everything else that comes under the umbrella of Utah. That in the Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey documentary that came out on Netflix recently, there was case upon case that was looked at by law enforcement that wasn't pursued, of forced child marriages, of forced polygamy, which is illegal, of rape and sexual abuse. It was rife, and there were so many cases of it. But it seemed as though it was only picked up by certain key players in the justice system when it looked like it could favor certain people in political positions. And I guess that feeds in really nicely at looking into human trafficking laws, because that is one of the things that eventually landed Warren Jeffs behind bars.
Yes, and Keith Raniere too. So yes, so look, the criminal justice system, because if we go back to what we talked about in the beginning, which is that the criminal justice system, the players in it, the lawyers in it, are government. They're hired, they're employees of the government, and so there are many factors that influence their thinking. And so I know, I mean, in a lot of cases, not the kinds of cases that you're talking about, but in a lot of cases, for example, where we have a rape case, we feel that we have the criminal justice system does not take nor convict. Well, it's just a huge percentage of rape cases which are not ever put into the system, partly because people don't want to come forward to the system because they've been mistreated by the police. They've not been treated in a trauma-sensitive way. The whole system feels geared against them. But there are reasons why a district attorney would not take a rape case to trial. They don't want to take a case that they will lose because they're making bad law. They're setting a precedent. And there are lots of reasons that they might lose, not having to do with the strength or the truth of the victim. Now, when we talk about Utah, and I was just telling you about judges having their own their own life experiences. Well, when you have a state which has a predominant religion, then you have a lot of people within the system that share that religion, and they don't view it in the same way. That's the only thing, that I can say about that. In addition, I will tell you in addition to what you're talking about in Utah, there is so much evidence of criminal activity in so many of these cults I have personally called the FBI myself about one of them that I happen to have evidence of, and I don't even get a call back. And so I guess what I'm saying is that we know that these cults are out here doing a lot of things. I think that it is because our system is either overtaxed, there aren't enough people, there isn't the concern, there are other higher priorities. I don't know what it is. I wish I knew what it was, but it's not just in Utah that these things are being ignored. And that is one of the reasons that the federal law is very important, because it is outside of, it can be tried in a state court, but it is a federal law that is applicable across all the different states. The thing that I think of when I think of the human trafficking law is that in the United States, in the South, in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, when people were marching for civil rights, then it was the federal government and the federal laws that became important in empowering that fight, not state laws, because the states saw things in a particularly racist way in some states. And so it required federal governments to come in and federal laws to be enforced for there to be any momentum. And I hope for that in cults, because I think the human trafficking law, the federal law, is really made for cults because it has to do with enticing or recruiting someone to perform a sex act that benefits somebody by fraud or coercion. So doesn't that sound like what happens in these cults? By fraud
Sounds
or coercion?
it sounds exactly like what happens. And the cynical part of me thinks that perhaps these religious groups aren't pursued by law enforcement in the way that they should be, despite evidence being provided about crimes against them, is because of the protection that religious groups have, the status that religious
Yes,
groups have. It's kind of like
yes,
it's kind of like you saying, say you vouch for someone. Oh, I vouch for that person. They're great. Let them have all these benefits of joining our friendship group. Whatever those benefits are. You get board game nights on a Tuesday and you cook dinner for everyone on a Saturday, whatever it looks like. They can join our friendship group. I vouch for them. And then they turn out to be somebody really awful. And then you're sitting there looking really silly and you have to be held accountable because it was your suggestion. The government has given all of these protections to religious groups,
yes,
and if law enforcement pursue all of the crimes that these protected groups are committing, who does it look bad on? It looks bad on the institution that gave these groups the protections and the tax exemptions to begin with.
yes.
I don't know. I
Indeed,
just
it
get
does.
frustrated.
No, I completely understand that because look, I've had people tell me that they have gone to law enforcement with what is clearly sexual assault. It meets the definition of sexual assault, and have police say to them, "We can't do anything about it because it's a religious group." Now that is just wrong. First of all, it's wrong advice because you can. It's action, not belief. We don't get a pass, go collect $200 because you're a religious group. You simply don't. But we have too many people who are frightened of the power that we have given them in the United States. And absolutely, I had a woman tell me that she went to the police to tell them about what was happening to her daughter, and first of all they said it's consensual. Okay, so now there can be no consent. So, in case this hasn't, come up in any of your podcasts, there can be no consent in these power imbalance relationships. There can't be. That's why I love the human trafficking law. It's because it's not about consent. It's about what happened. What did the perpetrator use to manipulate the other person, not about whether they consented to it. So there should be no issue of consent when a person is, let's say, in some of the yoga ashrams that I have investigated, where people are there, have been there for years, make no money, work for free, and then are sexually assaulted, there is nothing that they can do about it because they don't have enough money to get out of the ashram. No less, and of course, no one within the ashram would listen, because what they say is that's the teacher. He can do no wrong. So if he harmed you, it's you that's wrong. So, of course, what are you going to do about that? Nothing. You have no options. So consent is not an issue from my point of view. Sometimes a survivor will come forward and say, I know that it looked like I consented. I never think it looks like people consented, because consent is a kind of free will, like having choices. And in these situations of fraud and coercion, there is no choice.
I think that's where some of the cases on co-conspirators of cult leaders are really difficult as well. I was reading recently that Linda Kasabian, who was a member of the Manson family, recently passed away. And it makes me think about those that followed him that are still incarcerated. And there's this big debate on whether they should be or not. And it's tough.
Yes.
It's a very tough discussion to have because of coercion and because of what was done of someone's own free will and what wasn't. And even under duress or coercion, you still can't commit murder. So it's a really tough one.
I think that it's, again, they were victims as well in many ways. I think that's what you're saying,
Yeah.
um, and again, I think that maybe the line in the sand has to be action. When you take the gun and you kill, when you take the knife and you stab, that is an action. We can perhaps understand that you were a victim of it as well, but we seem to be a society that, at least to some extent, feels that you have to pay for your actions.
There's the big discussion around on whether people who have parole hearings should be released because they've served time for the crimes they committed, and because they're no longer under the influence of the person that perhaps coerced them to commit those crimes in the first place. Are they still a threat to the public? Some people say yes, some people say no, and then you're back to having that argument after the fact. Even though you're not talking about the crimes the person has committed, you're now talking about the crimes that they may commit, even though Charles Manson is dead. So this is I'm kind of taking us off topic, but it's stuff that's still really interesting to me to just try and unpack and understand. But you mentioned that there are some yoga groups you've worked with, some Buddhist groups. What
Yes.
size are the faith-based communities that you typically find yourself working with? Are they massive groups, small groups? Do you work with like family groups and one-on-one groups?
So the answer is yes to all of it, practically. Although I haven't worked with like a family domestic situation. But what I would say is that I've worked with a very large group. So the one of the Buddhist groups is a very large community. I think someone said they had 10,000 members. So that's extremely large, long history in the United States as well, at least decades. The yoga groups that I've worked with have been large also. But as you know, some of these cult organizations are quite small. So we're seeing more as we as we look at the landscape ahead of us, in front of us, what we see is that there are, someone said, I don't know if this is true, 10,000 cults in the United States alone. And I would guess that a lot of them are very, very small. And so we just talked with a woman, for example, who was in a cult of 8 people. So I don't look at size. I look at the action. Of course, I have to look at the obstacles, because we never want to take a survivor down a path that's going to be potentially harmful and have no possibility of success. So I look at the statute of limitations. I look at the actions to see if there is a law that says you can't do that, because we can't focus on the religious beliefs. And the third thing that I focus on, which sounds kind of strange but is not really a surprise, is assets. So if in the civil justice system, the currency is money, but the cult has no money, then we can't take a person down that path, because there will not be any success. And so those are the kinds of obstacles that we look at.
Do you find that the groups that you are contacted by, or the groups that you work with, are splinter groups that get slightly more damaging and extremist and destructive the further away from the major religion that they found themselves, if that makes sense?
Well, it's an interesting question. What I have seen is that in the religious and faith-based communities that have lineages, where you have your original teacher, and then you are like the mentee of that teacher, and then you get your own group. Yes, I think that what you're saying is a possibility. What I have also seen, though, is that the original teacher was corrupt in his actions. So I'm thinking of the groups of teachers who present themselves as celibate. As soon as I hear that word, I have a very have a cynical reaction, like you do, Casey, to some of these things. I am thinking, yeah, but no. I'm thinking, but maybe not. And in fact, many of the groups that I have been involved with have been with teachers who were, and I'm using, air quotes around the word celibate, because they are not celibate. And yet the designation of celibacy has given women particularly, although again sometimes men, the sense that they are safe there. Here is the sense of security, because this is a man, and what I know is, and you said it earlier, that power imbalance that we have in society makes women vulnerable to harm in that way. So here is a place where I am not going to be vulnerable to harm, because this leader and the people around him are celibate. But guess what? They are not. And so it's a kind of a double whammy, if you will. It's a confusion about what that is when you've been taught about celibacy, you've taken certain vows of celibacy, and then you find yourself assaulted by the teacher who's been teaching celibacy. It's very confusing.
By design, I imagine, as well, because victims always talk about, I was confused. I didn't really understand what was happening. It didn't feel right. I didn't enjoy it, but I didn't know how to say no because, if I say no to any sort of sexual interaction with my teacher turns around and says, I'm celibate. So it's
Yeah.
almost gaslighting somebody before the event has even taken place.
It absolutely is. And of course, gaslighting is the right word for what happens in these communities. So when from the top to the bottom, the gaze is upward, and there is this unwavering belief in the rightness of the teacher, and the unwavering belief that the teacher cannot be wrong, and if he harms you, that you are the one who is wrong, is another enormous gaslighting situation. That's why, in fact, some of the survivors that have been through the civil justice system find some solace in it. I just talked to a man the other day who was assaulted as a child in a religious organization, and he's not a client of mine, but he is somebody that I know and have kept in touch with, and his case has been 2 years trying to get over one legal hurdle, about whether the law is retroactive and therefore allows him to bring a claim. And I said to him, are you frustrated by how long this is taking? And I was so surprised. He said to me, no, I'm not frustrated at all. He said, I feel liberated. I feel liberated because I am fighting back. And I may lose, but I have fought. And I thought, wow, that is a perspective that I hadn't expected. And so I hold on to that, thinking that maybe not being silenced, like maybe even in this case, the fact that the courts of the state that he is in I think that there have been 1, 2, 3, 5 hearings, and it's going up to the Supreme Court of the state that he is in, because they are listening to him. It's a completely, the legal issue involved doesn't have anything to do with him, but he is bringing that fight, and it's liberating.
In between all of those down periods as well, where the lawyers like yourself are trying to get over the hurdles, to have the information to feed back to clients who are eagerly waiting, I imagine, in most cases, for an update, for some type of progress, to hear any news about what's happening, there's still that thing in the background that's happening where there are cult leaders and cult groups that have been served legal papers and will know that they should feel uncomfortable. So even when things are not moving, there is still that kind of satisfying feeling that, there's still
Yes,
people that know they've been found out, or
yes,
that people are no longer gonna keep silent about what's happened to them. So that's still kind of, that's still kind of
it
satisfying.
is. I hadn't thought of that, but you're absolutely right. It goes back to what you said in the beginning, I think, when we were talking about the fact that just having them called on the carpet, that narcissist who has all of that control has no control. So this narcissistic cult participant, in this case, has no control. The organization that this sex predator of a child was in and who was enabled by has no control, because
So
the court is going to decide it on a completely different issue, and they may win, but they've had to fight it for 2 years. And that is, you're right, I think that's a tremendous satisfaction. And also, during the down times, this is what I hope, at least what I hope is that during the down times, the times when nothing is happening, that what we want people to feel is that we're carrying the battle, that we have the weapons, that we are that you are not having to carry this alone anymore. So it's not this guy, who was 15 and raped having to do this. It is having a team of people around him who are willing to fight for it. And that brings, I hope, some solace, some comfort.
There's been so many cases of extreme cult activity that has happened when the leader has been questioned or put under certain pressure because people have walked away, because outsiders have started to take notice, because law enforcement have started to get involved, whether that means that the leader goes on the run, is on the FBI's most wanted
Mm,
list, moves a
mhm.
group out to the jungles of South America, whatever that
Yes,
looks like. There are so many cases in history where you can see the pressure of not being in total control of everybody can make a leader unravel. And in some cases, that, of course, has ended in tragedy. But in some cases, it's just ended in the group dissolving, just
yes.
just dissolving. I've read it in memoirs. I read it in Durette Bouillon's memoir, An Everyday Cult. Sometimes when one or two people leave, that is enough for people to just be like, why, what are we doing here? Why do we let ourselves be treated this way? And then everybody, and it just disbands, and and it can happen as simply as that. So this this individual who's been waiting 2 years to
Yes.
get over this next hurdle, that pressure on that person that he's brought this lawsuit against for the abuse, for the exploitation, for the horrific treatment of a 15-year-old child, that pressure enough might be changing lives from the inside, and we might never know about that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes, it's as we were talking before about how seeds get planted, you know, it's very much um, that we need to have more public awareness that these things are wrong. I know in my own experience that after I did the first investigation and corroborating of women's stories of sexual assault, that I had women coming to me saying, I didn't even know that this was wrong. And when I say that to people, they say, how is that possible? Everyone knows that rape is wrong. But what they're not recognizing is that the context in which sexual assault takes place makes a difference. And so I had one woman say to me, well, I guess it's true. If this had happened to me in a dark alley by a stranger, I would have known I'd been raped. But because it was a teacher and I had been taught the things that I had been taught that we've been talking about, I didn't recognize it. I was told it was a spiritual practice. I was taught that. And I think about the gymnasts who were assaulted by Larry Nasser.
Mm.
They didn't recognize it because of the context, right? Because he was the coach, because their parents, in some cases, were in the room. So the context matters in what people understand about what happened to them. And that's why the statutes of limitations have to be longer, because a seed has to be planted, or 10 years later, somebody has to say to them, sweetie, you were raped, for them to understand.
I just had a thought that hadn't even occurred to me until you mentioned about understanding an experience. And if it would have happened in an alleyway, I would have known. What do you do when it comes to purity, culture, and the lack of sex and relationship education in high demand religious groups where women may not realize that they are having non-consensual sex, and men may not realize that they are having sex with their wives without their wives' consent?
That's like a question that's above my pay grade. Sometimes I have to say, I'm just the lawyer, because there's a lot of our society that does not understand consent, whether they're in a high demand group or not. There are a lot of men that feel that they do not, a lot of young men in universities, for example, who do not understand consent. We need tremendous amount of education around the issue of consent.
We're speaking in quite binary terms through a lot of this terminology as well, in terms of women's rights movement, the equal rights movement, sexual harassment in the workplace typically being between men and women. With any of these cases, do you come across members of the LGBTQIA plus community who are navigating their own lawsuits of sexual misconduct in faith-based groups? And does that law, or do those procedures look any different for a marginalized community group, or would it be the same in terms of the binary sense of men and women?
I think here's what the way that I think about it. The way that I think about it is, and I think I said it before, the law is gender neutral. So we have this vision of the law, of the statue of the justice with her, with a blindfold. It should not matter. It should not matter, because
Mm.
the law, and by that I mean the law as it is written on paper. Now, when we're talking about uh, marginalized groups like LBGTQ, then of course not all states have those laws.
Yeah.
Not all states protect those marginalized groups. A number of states do. So the point is that the law on paper should be gender neutral. It should be, kind of it should not be looking at any of those things. But we would be naive if we did not think that the whole system and process that we're involved in is that we have to recognize it's run by human beings who have a lot of different views on these topics, and their experiences and what they've been taught, and the insularity of some of the communities that they live in mean that they're on juries and they do not see things necessarily in the same way. So it's a system run by humans on a law that is should be blind to those kinds of considerations. I personally feel, having worked with both men and women in the kinds of cases that I run, that men have a different but equally difficult challenge to deal with when they have been sexually assaulted. They are running against some kind of cultural bias of who is a victim and who is a survivor. And I think that they're running against a cultural picture of what men are. So they have an uphill struggle, perhaps in a different way, but no less difficult a way than women do.
Thank you for answering that question, Carol. I appreciate that. I often try and think about what the picture looks like for everyone. And I think if you're a person and a crime has been committed against you as an individual, that's it. As you said, that's all that really needs to be said. So I have a listener. Hello, Pamela, if you're listening. She messages me occasionally and we talk about Kundalini yoga. I think that's an interesting group to look at, because if you trace back the history of where the group started, Yogi Bhajan, the founder and leader of 3HO, which still exists today, influenced a lot of other cultic groups to start up. I think of the Source family with James Edward Baker, who followed Bhajan around for a long time, took a lot of influence from him, created his own group, which ended after James Edward Baker dived off a cliff trying to paraglide for the first time and just kind of landed in the sand and died on the beach. Um, which is ironic because, he told his followers he he couldn't die. So 3HO and Kundalini Yoga, that still exists today. It's not one of these groups that fizzled out over time. It's still very influential. Is this one of the groups that you've worked with, or a group that's aligned with the teachings of Yogi Bhajan?
Well, I would say that I have not worked with this group, but I have worked with similar groups, and who have also not fizzled out. In fact, I often think of cult leaders as being like cats who have 9 lives. They often um, kind of fall from view and then re-emerge in another place, another name, but the same kind of process of manipulating people. But I have been with other yoga groups, and they are still in, they are still in existence. But I guess that the short of being able to put them out of business, which is not always possible, that the only thing that you can do is to make the pain that we've been talking about um, difficult enough, painful enough that they have to change. So what I see is that so far they've been under no pressure to change. I think that was the case with Yogi Bhajan. I think that these things are handed down through the lineage, the kind of what I have seen in the groups that I have worked with, a kind of lineage of sexual assault. And I don't know. I do know that 3HO has been involved. Their current organization leadership has been involved in some kind of reparations program. I don't know about how it is working, but the hope always is, whether we're talking about a religious organization or a business organization, that the pain is enough that it forces them to change, because I no longer believe that we can ask them to change and have them agree to do it because they see the error of their ways. They don't. And so for me, where I'm sitting, it's all about how much pain will it take. And I think that's what's happened there. Would you agree with if I don't know who you're speaking of, but I do know a Pamela involved there. And there we have a situation where a person came forward and said, this is crazy. This is not what it looks like to those of you looking from the outside in.
Yeah, yeah. It was Yogi Bhajan I thought of immediately when you talked about yoga groups and lineage, because there was this whole controversy over
Yes,
whether he was a true yogi or not to begin with, and how they went on this big
yes,
escapade to trace his history, and they weren't able to do it, basically confirming that he wasn't who he said he was at the very beginning of
yes.
this group. And yet here we are today. And the interesting thing about my conversation with Pamela was a few weeks ago, she said, you should interview this incredible lawyer called Karen Murchison, who's doing all this stuff around sexual misconduct in religious groups. And then she told me about some of the work that you've done. So she mentioned Project Sunshine, which you've already talked to us about, but she also mentioned Project Satya.
Yes, I love both of these groups for similar reasons. So uh, Buddhist Project Sunshine was about I told you the first investigation that I did, and it was it was shining a light. That was the sunshine. It was like, we need to shine a light on this, and that is really, really the case. And the other thing that it did was, it of course created a public group discussion about this. So one of the things, as you know, that happens in cults is there can be no discussion. There can't be any, oh my goodness, the leader sexually assaulted me. Let's talk about that. What is that about? No, that cannot happen. because the whole thing is framed as the leader is infallible. So the Buddhist Project Sunshine was great because Andrea Wynn created a community of people, and she started just on her own pursuing this. And when I met her and volunteered to do an investigation and to corroborate what the women were saying, then things became very public, and the leader stepped down or stepped away. The board stepped down because, of course, they were aware but did not do anything. All of those kinds of things. So this, what I think of as a grassroots community organization that supports the discussion and then supports the survivors who have been silenced all of these years. It's like, this is a great, great template for what needs to be happening, particularly in larger cults like 3HO, like any number of them that are out there, where we know that there has been this assault. So Project Satya. So this was in response to one woman who came forward in December of 2019 and said, my yoga teacher has assaulted me for all of these years. Now, this was, of course, somebody who was dead, but was supposed to have been celibate. That's the whole celibacy thing. And so she came forward on her own many, many years after all of this had happened. Not unusual. People sometimes say to me in their kind of disbelieving voice, well, why didn't they say something sooner? And I feel like saying, what? Go away. Never mind. But I generally try to respond nicely. And I say, because trauma has that effect on people. These organizations have that effect on people. But in any case, Project Satya was formed after this woman came forward. They put together a Facebook page. They had 3 moderators of the page. They invited people to come there and to support this woman. And that is what they did. And it made a huge difference. Both Buddhist Project Sunshine and Project Satya in how things unfolded after that, because their support of the first woman who came forward gave so much permission and freedom and safety that other people came forward. And then things began to change. Now, they haven't changed in all of the ways that they need to change yet, but that grassroots organization made that possible, because otherwise each and every one of those women is out there on their own, and they need the support of the community. They need people to say to them, thank you. This is really courageous and brave of you to do this. We support you. That's what's needed.
And when you talk about that security and that safety that is cultivated by these groups that are put together by individuals, this is the difference between a false sense of security and a coercive and destructive cult-like environment, and a not cult-like environment where people are actually truly in a safe space, supported by people who have no agenda other than supporting one another, listening to one another, social change and justice. This is when people say, well, what does a good cult look like then? I would say this is more like, if good cults exist, if benign cults exist, this is what they look like. Destructive cults are the ones where they tell you you're safe and you absolutely are anything but.
Yes. Yeah, I think that is true. I would say that it's hard to, as I said in the beginning, hard to define a cult, but they by the very virtue of the fact that they are willing to listen and to support and to make change, that they can't even fall into the cult definition. because that is what cults are not able to do. They are not able to change because there's only one person, and that person has to be right.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
sometimes wonder, whether our world has become so complicated for us as human beings that we are more and more seeking some kind of false sense of comfort that somebody else is going to make decisions for us. I wonder, like, sometimes people will say to me, well, but what's wrong with the person who joins a cult? Like, why do they do that? As if this whole thing were their fault.
Mm.
And I I often tell people, well, first of all, people are born into these situations, so they have no opportunity to have any other point of view. There's nothing wrong with them other than the having been born into it. Um, Another thing is that I think that people who have been traumatized as children or young adults are seeking some kind of spiritual path and healing that this appears to give them. And the third thing that I would say is that as human beings, we are made to trust other human beings. Trust is what makes civilization move forward. And so, if our fault is that we were too trusting, that's not really our fault. It's the fault of the person who takes advantage of that trust. And I would like for people who are surviving and moving into thriving from cult experiences to realize that it isn't about something that they did wrong. It's about what somebody else did wrong.
I always think about Esther Friedman calling her time in her destructive group a misadventure. And I think that it's kind of tongue in cheek, enjoyable terminology that because she's got a very funny sense of humor, Esther Friedman. But it's also recognizing that there's no victim blaming in the term
No,
misadventure. And I think that
no,
that is, it's playful, but it's also recognizing that actually it wasn't Esther's fault. So sometimes
right.
I do like to use that term when people talk about like, my tenure in a group, or
Yes.
misadventure. And in terms of trying to have simplicity in life or for someone else to take responsibility for our decision makings from time to time, something that I've talked about a lot recently is the current climate that we are living in, both the actual
Hmm.
climate and the
Yes.
socio-economic climate, the political climate. And I often go back to periods in history where we've seen this before, where cults popped up at the turn of the century, where cults popped up in the 60s and 70s, where there was war, where there was a big gap between the rich and the poor, where there was a cost of living crisis, where there was mistrust with the government because people are lying about things. I mean, just look at the former president of the United States of America and
Let's
all
not.
these yeah, I mean, all these indictments and all of these things that are
Yes.
happening, and no one knows what
Yes.
the truth is. And one news station says one thing and one says another. It's being glamorized to slave yourself for 14, 16 hours a day at work for minimum wage. It's being glorified like you should have this
Yes.
really strong work ethic and really still not be able to afford to live. It's such a strange time. And when you put technology into the spin, when you put this huge development with artificial intelligence that's just happened in the last couple of weeks, with chat gpt becoming something that
Yes.
members of the public can use. It's a very strange time. What we didn't have at the turn of the century and in the 60s and 70s that we have now are virtual community spaces
Mhm. Mhm.
and online cultic groups So we're really in a precarious time where individuals who want to take advantage of people, that want to exploit people for their own gain, they're going to be finding people that just don't
Yes,
want the pressure of having to make decisions anymore, that don't know which
absolutely.
political party to vote for, that don't know how to get out of the Groundhog Day feel of I'm just working to live. And
Right.
I'm just sorry, I'm just living to work. There's probably a lot of people in the world that feel exactly how you've just explained, Carol, and this kind of um climate in the world, we've just lived through a pandemic as well. So there is that to consider. There's all these fuel costs going up, there's trains derailing all over the place. I read something about a meteor crashing in Vegas or Texas. The world is just in a wild place.
Right. Who could blame a person who seeks a simpler life? You know, I think that's the kind of the thing of what you're describing is that we have decision fatigue, we have all kinds of fatigue, and that it's and my point on this is that again, who could blame people who want something simpler? We have
Mm,
no connection with nature. We're destroying the planet. I mean, there's a lot to be, there's a lot that would drive a sane person, a thinking person, a smart person to want something simpler. The to me, what we always have to look at is the person who manipulates and takes it for their gain, as opposed to the person who is idealistic and looking for something better, more spiritual in their life. Those are good
mm.
things.
So Pamela also mentioned to me about your book, and
Ah,
I wondered if you could tell the listeners about This Is Mexico, and where people can find a copy of This Is Mexico.
yes, well, so, in my retirement, having been a lawyer, I was used to, you know, working a lot. And so when I retired, I moved to Mexico with my husband. And we intended to move here for like a year. We thought it would be something to like kick off retirement with. And so that was in 2005. And right now I am sitting in Mexico. And so it's been quite a few years now that we've been here. So I started writing because I was in the midst of people saying to me things like, "Oh my God, you moved to Mexico? You'll be dead in a month." That that kind of thing. And so I started writing emails to my family and then my friends talking about the kind of unbelievably resourceful, resilient, beautiful culture and people of Mexico, which, just like the United States, has its own problems, to be sure. And then eventually I started writing essays, and eventually I put all of the essays into a book that is called This is Mexico: Tales of Culture and Other Complications. And so it's kind of a book of humor and sadness at the same time. Sadness of a country that is so rich in so many ways, but for whom many of its citizens are continuing to be way too poor. And it's about how living here changed my perspective on life itself. And it's on Amazon. So for anyone who would like a copy, thank you for that. That's been quite some time ago.
I'll definitely put a link to that in the episode description. I think there's a theme in your work, Carol, that is, rooting for the underdog in all
It is.
possible, in all the ways possible.
It absolutely is. I have come to recognize that, and uh, and I feel quite strongly about it. And you're right. It manifests in my feeling about Mexico, which is definitely what I think of as an an understood, misunderstood culture, particularly by the United States and other Western countries, including the UK, where it is simply not, it is not understood. The richness of its indigenous population, the richness of the people and the strength of community that they have, it doesn't translate as easily into the Western view of the world as it might. So that was my small contribution. Thank you.
And for help with that translation, you can pick up your copy of This is Mexico. In terms of your workload right now, just to kind of finish up today, I wondered if you could tell the listeners how many cases do you have open, and do you expect any of them to be concluding anytime soon?
Now, the legal system, it's a long process. We probably have, so I just to put this into context, I have a small group within McAllister Olivarius, which is in Maidenhead, just outside of London. And our small group is focused solely on sexual misconduct in spiritual communities. And as you've alluded to earlier, that includes Christians, it includes, Catholicism, all kinds of Christian denominations, as well as other groups that are not necessarily viewed as religions, perhaps by the Western world, but are a spiritual or cult organizations. So we have a small group. We're in our really our first, I would say, first 2 or 3 years of bringing these kinds of cases. And so we have them in a variety of stages. I would say that within our group, we have probably in queue, with a number that are being brought and a number that are waiting to be brought, probably about 14 cases.
Wow.
And so we're in federal court, we're in state court, we're in Canada, we're in the United States, and we are in different stages of the litigation process, which is a long, if you think about it as that track with the hurdles there, we're just constantly moving forward and going over the hurdles.
I was talking to my partner last night about this upcoming interview, and I told him that you're probably one of the most sought after individuals in the country of America right now, because I seem to hear so many stories of individuals being sexually abused as children, as young adults, as adults in spiritual groups and faith-based communities. But again, perhaps that's just my echo chamber because all I do is this work. I don't want to believe that that is all that humanity is. Otherwise, I might lose my mind. But that being said, a lot of people that listen to this show will be individuals that have had those experiences. So if they felt like they wanted to pursue their own lawsuit, is that something that you would be able to help them with or direct them to people that could?
Absolutely. So the way that it generally works, and it has certainly worked this way with other podcasts that have been done. Somebody hears you talking, they're in your loyal audience base, and they say, wow, maybe I'm ready to do this, but I don't know whether there's a possibility. So what we do, what we'll do, Casey, is I will give you the law firm's email, I'm sorry, their website address is what I meant to say, and they can go on the website, they can look and see what our group is doing, and there's a contact form on there where they can send us a message. I see every single message that comes into the law firm, and when I see one that is like this, where people are saying, I heard you talking with Casey and I want to talk with you, then we're going to talk with you. And so what we're going to be doing is assessing, is it possible? So we're going to be, we're looking at all of those hurdles that we have to overcome. We're going to see about the statute of limitations, where it took place, all of those kinds of things. But we're going to do a kind of just a little intake of those things, and then we're going to let you know what we think. If sometimes we can't take a case, then we might give you some information about somebody else. Sometimes it's because we don't practice in a particular state, and so we might refer you out there. But what that stage of it is just advising. And just so your listeners know as well, because a lot of people, clearly, why should they be familiar with the legal system if you're lucky you haven't been involved in it? But in these kinds of cases, we take cases on what we call a no win, no fee. So we don't ask people for money. When we feel that we can win a case, we don't take a case we can't win, because we're not going to take you down that road to failure if we can help it. But the whole thing is based on you're not needing money up front to pay lawyers. It's a way that law has developed in the United States, at least, of saying this should be accessible to everyone. So we'll share the risk with you. In fact, we will carry the risk on the financial end. And so that's something that people ought to know, because a lot of people say to me, well, I can't afford a lawyer.
Especially when you're coming up against huge faith-based groups that have billions of dollars in revenue and some of the most cutthroat, experienced, and dodgy lawyers.
Yes, yes, absolutely. That and many other obstacles. You just can't, we can't make financial stability a part of bringing justice to people, or else we've failed as a society.
So if anybody listening feels as though they have a case that they would like to bring to Carol and her team, and they're wondering, is it possible? Carol would say, that depends.
Yeah,
Fill out the
that's right.
form on the website and we will find out. We'll talk to you about it and we'll see what the answers are to those questions. And I think it's obvious from my conversation with you today, Carol, that survivors' well-being, the voices of survivors, what is best for them, that is at the forefront of your mission. It's clear that those are the values that you hold in yourself as an individual, even if you were working with a law firm or independently. It's clear that you are a person that wants to help people. So I think that there could be a few individuals reaching out to you after our conversation today. I genuinely could speak to you all day. I feel like I've just barely scratched the surface on all of the things that I want to ask you. You've had such an incredible life of working in law, and now in your 70s, in your retirement, you're here still working with no signs of slowing down. I just think it's absolutely incredible work. It's changing lives. It's going to change policy. It's going to change law. It's going to change how the world works. And we've talked about lineage. We've talked about legacy. We've talked about how current cult leaders learned from the leaders before them and the leaders before them. But it also works on the flip side of that as well. So you could be inspiring people to train themselves and go to law school and understand that this is what they want to do with their lives, and understand that they want to help people in the same way that you've helped them. And I just think it's such amazing work. So thank you so much for your time today, Carol.
Thank you so much for having me. I have enjoyed our conversation immensely, and right back at you on doing the work that you're doing. It makes an enormous difference. The awareness that you're raising is it is the thing that makes the difference in the end. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you to James as well. James, if you tune in, if you listen, thank you for your help in coordinating our conversation today. James had some very nice, kind things to say about the podcast. So big shout out to another listener of the show as well. And I will let you go and enjoy the rest of your beautiful spring day in Mexico, Carol. Take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye bye bye.
Bye.